and record. Here we go. And welcome to another episode of DevOpsSpeakeasy podcast. Today with me in my very virtual studio, as we're still all quarantined, my co-host Kat Cosgrove, developer advocate with JFrog. And we are very honored to host the one and only John Willis with us.
There you go.
Hey, my name is Baruch. I'm head of developer advocacy in JFrog as well. And with that, just a little bit of background. You probably know John Willis. You should if you don't. But for the two of you who don't know who John is, co-author of one of the most important books in DevOps, the DevOps Handbook, author of couple of dozens other books. One of the pioneers of the term DevSecOps, that we'll probably touch a little bit about that as well. Was with Chef when Chef was cool, was with Docker when Docker was cool, and now I guess with Red Hat when Red Hat is cool. We're going to talk about that as well. Right? Did I forget any of your regalia?
I think the most important thing is I'm a big deal. No, only kidding. I always hate these intros.
No, but actually that's a very, very good description.
Stop it, you know. And then I'm like, okay, it's like the Bill Murray in they join the army, you know, like, and they go around and ask him. He's like, he gives that kind of answer, you know, no big deal. You know, so, anyway, that's how yeah, no, I mean it's good, and it's, you know, this virtual world is kind of interesting, and so I think somebody said now's a really good time to really get good at guitar playing. So
yeah, we see your background. It has the guitar, it has the drums. What's going on?
Yeah, that's so what happened. We were going to buy a house. Good thing we didn't. We were literally ready to buy a new house, and then, you know, I got cold feet, and so my family has sort of torn up my room that I use for my music studio. But that's my son. My son is a killer drummer, man.
Oh,
and so he plays drums to me, and
I think your internet is lagging, right, Kat?
But yeah, I got a pretty good little studio set up here. So yeah, I have that problem sometimes. Is it okay now?
Yeah. Now you're kind of back, but you know, we are on Zoom, and Zoom is doing decent job with crappy internet, so we'll be fine. It's kind of okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. All right. So I think we made an intro, and
where do we start?
Yeah, when do we start? I think we can start with
wait a minute. Now you're a pretty big deal too, dude. You know, so let me, like, you know, I always do this. I always sit here and listen to you. I mean, so my joke is, you know, I'll know the gig is up the morning you wake up and realize I'm not that smart. And I'm like, they finally caught on to me. You know, Baruch figured it out. Now the rest of the world's gonna figure it out. So
no,
anyway.
You are one of the most respectful people in our industry for a very good reason. I mean, credit when credit is due. You completely deserved your reputation, and we are going to grill you a little bit, but it will be all in good respect.
Let's take a run. Let's go.
All right.
Totally grilling.
Red Hat Global Transformation Office.
Yeah, so, you know, interesting. You know, most people, if you know me, you should probably know Andrew Clay Schaefer, and we've been buddies for, you know, I met him when he was one of the original founders of Puppet, and, you know, I knew Luke back in the day, and this was even before I went to work, you know, started going into the whole chef thing early on. And we've been just great friends. And in fact, I was the reason I actually got into DevOps was Andrew, you know, Michael Cote, for those who don't remember, and this guy named Israel Gatt, who was like sort of an agile, they ran a podcast called the Agile Executive, and Andrew was their guest. And I knew Andrew, and, you know, and I knew him through sort of Puppet. And then they were talking about agile infrastructure and agile operations. And I was listening to podcasts on a road trip. I know more about this. What is this? There's a place for me here. And then he told me about sort of Patrick DeBar and what he was doing. And I tracked him down over in Europe, and he invited me to the first DevOps day in Ghent. I was at Canonical there, and travel. They would give Canonical sponsorship, and so I went over there, and I was actually the only American at the first DevOps day. And then literally that just, I had been doing Tivoli stuff for about 10 years. And I was just sort of tired of our industry. I mean, I at that point, I'd had a good, 30 years in this thing. And I just felt like we weren't really ever solving any problems. I'm not sure if we still are, but hey, but at that point I was, I really was like, at the crossroads of like, this is sort of nonsense that we do all this work for these large customers. And we never really, I had a consulting company that worked as a subcontractor for IBM, and we'd take over after IBM had done a ton of work, and we'd spend a year just trying to get it stable. Anyway, long story short, I saw all these young kids talking about this way of doing things completely different. I was already sold on Puppet and the infrastructure as code thing. And I caught on fire. I knew Damon. I came back. I was working at Chef at the time, and I remember asking, Jesse Robbins, who was he was basically the CEO of Chef at the time. It was originally called Ops Code, but he was also the program chair for O'Reilly Velocity. And I said, hey, do you think O'Reilly would get mad if we did a tail end DevOps day after Velocity? And he said, they won't sponsor it, but yeah, they don't mind. And then we ran the first DevOps days at LinkedIn in Silicon Valley and Mountain View. And that was the first. And put in perspective, we're like 40. I think it was 40. Chris Byte says it was 50. All right. At the Ghent, we go back and forth on this, but make no mistake, like 7 months later, there were 300 people.
Yep.
At the first US one, right? And it was clear that like this was everything I felt I got to witness with 300 other people. But yes, this really is when I've been so like all that stuff we do. And he called me in September last year, and people don't know me. I've been independent most of my career. I sold a couple of companies. I stick around for a little bit. I sold a company to Docker. I sold a company to Dell. I stick around enough time to sort of run out my sort of the money I have to get to stay, to be honest with you, because I don't like working with big companies. And,
yep.
But Andrew calls me and says, hey, what would you think about coming to work with me at Red Hat? And, he was highly recruited because he was at Cloud Foundry, Pivotal. And he'd done some amazing stuff there. And I was like, Andrew, I don't like big companies. And he was like, I think this is gonna be different. I got Kevin Bear with me, and I know Kevin really well. We're close friends, and he wrote the Phoenix Project. And Jay Bloom, if you ever met him, he's a freaking genius. And he said, I think it's gonna be different. And I was on a call with Jim Whitehurst a week later, the CEO at the time of Red Hat, and he shows up in a t-shirt, and and I just started saying, hey, I don't work well in big companies, and like he just put me at ease. And I mean, it's funny, my view of Red Hat before I worked for Red Hat, and my view of Red Hat now that I work there, I sort of get in the Kool-Aid, but I'm like 6 years old and I've seen a lot of Kool-Aid. But anyway, sort of our reputations and to try to put in an injection into Red Hat, ultimately IBM of, the idea is, if you were thinking about like sort of 2 decades of DevOps, the first decade we're done. And, it's sort of in place, I say the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. The glass half full is everything that as a community we've accomplished has been amazing, and I would put the umbrella of sort of open source and and sort of DevOps and software supply chains and cloud and all the variants of clouds. Like, these are all things that have created incredible commerce over the last 10 years. You couldn't have Uber, love it or leave it, but you couldn't have Uber. Back in the early days, we were working with Gene, we called this the Cambrian Explosion. So the glass is half full, right? So in the sort of, January 1st, 2020, right? But the glass is half empty, because now what we're seeing is, like, first off, what does the next 10 years look like? Like, we can't sort of just stick around and like pat ourselves on the back for 10 years now. Like, we're so awesome, we're DevOps, like, get out of my way. Don't you see this DevOps thing shield I have? It works, get out, and like, that doesn't work for the next 10 years. So now we're thinking about like transformation and what does the next 10 years look like? And and the glass is half empty. Because I think you both know that, like, if you go into any large bank, healthcare institute, it's still a small percentage of adoption. Right. Sure, yeah. And there's some stagnation too. Like, we're not seeing, we're getting into the 10th year and we're not seeing like the sort of exponential growth of adoption. So I think a lot of what we're thinking about is what are the things, how do we sort of break out of this, like, everything's great, DevOps is right, it's the right model, we're doing all the right stuff, but so my version of it, but in the general, is we're trying to figure out what transformation means. What is the next 10 years? And where are we missing, what lenses are we not using to see where we might not be sort of progressing at the adoptions that we really think this thing, we all know this is perfect, and not perfect, we all know this is right. The question is, why isn't it sort of accelerating?
So let me understand correctly.
So that's what GTO is sort of trying to figure out for sort of Red Hat and the industry, right? Like, Kevin, now, go ahead.
So I think it's more what you are saying is, okay, this transformation office is about implementation. It's about popularization. It's about taking what we learned through the first 10 years to the masses.
Well, and then also sort of accelerating, figuring out how to accelerate adoption, right? I mean, yes, what we've learned, what are the right principles, what is some of the nonsense, and what are the things that are sort of, like, all right, so first off, sort of filter out the nonsense, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And anybody can do that, right? But and so what are the things that are really rock solid, right? I mean, just now that we're sort of on the sort of the JFrog channel, right? I think we really have a good scope of sort of, as one of many pieces, artifact management, right? Like, you walk into a shop today, and if they don't really get that, you're like, okay, yes, we've got to, we're going to have to help you a little bit here, and it's one of a lot of list things that you would say, I was thinking about, like, if somebody says, or they do often say, John, come in, tell us what we, how we compare in our DevOps journey, right? And if I walked in and, like, you had no artifact management, and you sort of did Jenkins on Wednesdays, but you didn't, like, okay, you're not doing it right. So we sort of know what good looks like.
Yes.
And we know what the nonsense is. And
yes.
But the GTO is like, okay, let's make that table stakes. But then also, really, for me, and I think, again, Andrew has some really good stuff that we've been, actually, our first 4 months, almost 5 months now at Red Hat, we've sort of been in a discovery mode. I've been, like, just going, I do what I do. When Andrew said, I said, Andrew, what will I do at Red Hat, And he said, just do what you do. You do what you've always been doing. And so one of the things I've been doing is going into customers and just interviewing customers. This is what I've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years, is, meeting the people that do the work and having honest conversations with them. And now I'm doing that with sort of large Red Hat customers, right? And then, so you get to, and what you find then are the sort of, why is this organization not scaling or getting the adoption that they should? So a lot of what we're thinking about is, so, like, what are the missing pieces? And, I think, I'm sorry if you hate the word transformation, but like it's a word that's now been stuck upon us, and we've bonded with it, and so like we're just gonna have to use it. And so then the question is, how do we take what is the table stakes of DevOps and figure out what this thing called transformation means, which really means accelerating, in particularly digital transformation, accelerating that, so that we're not getting stagnant. And here's the thing, I get very meta. If we go back, I've been doing this 40 years now. I mean, one of the things that constantly happens in our industry is that we get we get like a 5, maybe 10-year run on something, and then something new comes along, and the new people have no history in the old stuff. And we sort of do we sort of we do everything all over again. And I think, one of the things when I first started hearing this digital transformation a couple of years start popping up in boardrooms, I thought, the most important thing we need to do is, I don't give a rip this is 5 years ago, I don't give a rip if we're not using the word DevOps anymore. I don't really care. Looking into the future 5 years ago to now, what I would really bother me is if we were reinventing the wheel all over again under this new thing called digital transformation. Right. So I think to me, that's an important point, is making sure that DevOps is necessary, but maybe not sufficient. I'm not willing to go there completely yet. I mean, if the industry wants to go in on digital transformation and say, well, that DevOps stuff was great last decade, I don't think we're there.
So do you think we'll get to a point where DevOps isn't a phrase we use anymore? It's not that it's not a thing, it's just that it's the way things are done. It's DevOps isn't like a thing you transform into, it's just the way we do things now.
I think that's sort of inevitable. I mean, I don't really care either way, as long as we're sort of like not repeating all the efforts over again. And we're, so if DevOps become, so I'm old enough to remember there used to be a magazine called Computer World. And the word computer,
I think they're still around.
It is still around, yeah. All right. And it used to be a big deal, like Computer World, and you'd race to read it. And the real reason you read it is because all the job offerings in the last 6 pages. But it was just the word computer. And like today, like people don't use the computer, and even cloud is sort of turned into sort of ground noise, right? And so I think to answer your question, the more likely scenario is DevOps becomes ground noise. Right, which is just it's sort of in our DNA. You had DevOps, absolutely, yes, you have that, but like we're beyond that. And like it's like walking into there's be a day when you go in a presentation, even in the early days of cloud, right? It used to be fun. Like there used to be these cloud camp conferences, and like 3 years in, like you were the odd person out if you actually started your presentation with what is a cloud. Like you shouldn't have to do a what is a cloud anymore. Like, there'll be a point of which you probably shouldn't have to walk in everybody and say, a lot of my presentations now are like, I'm going to assume based on what I know about your organization that so do you know what DevOps is? You sort of practice your own version of it. Let's move beyond that and assume that, so I think it becomes sort of the part of our DNA. Does that make sense, Kat?
It does. Thank you. And I think that's to move into.
I disagree with you that now people know what DevOps is, and I'll tell you why. I look at the amount of job postings for DevOps engineers, and I realize that most of the industry has no idea what DevOps is. John is stuck with a very descriptive image.
I don't disagree. That's why I said I don't think we're there yet. And then there's always this sort of spectrum, even in the cloud. Am I okay right now? Oh no, it's not.
Yeah, we can hear you, but on your picture you are still drinking, but we can hear you.
Okay. But even in the early cloud camps, as we got 3 years in, I'd realize I wouldn't present what is a cloud and give you sort of the basics, and then the next person after me would do that, and I'd realize a third of the room were hearing about the cloud for the first time. So I think that's where we're in now, right now. I think you're right. I think there's a lot of people just coming into, what is this DevOps thing? So we're in an arc where, like, we hadn't hit a sort of a saturation point where the assumptive is that everybody knows DevOps and it's table stakes. I think we're still a little ways from that, but I think that will happen at some point. but we'll have more people will sort of know what DevOps. I mean, you know, if you think about what DevOps is today, like there is no Fortune 1000 company where there isn't some type of DevOps initiative going on.
Of course.
Sure,
right?
Because at scale, like if you're not releasing however many times a week, you're still releasing once every 3 months, and your competitor is able to release, you know, a dozen times a week, you're going to get destroyed. So
yeah, absolutely. And there is that sort of like, you know, you start looking over your shoulder and like you start realizing what you're I remember there was a great story back, you know, probably about 10 years ago about one, you know, two of the trading, you know, E-Trade and somebody else. And one of the companies found out that their competitor's customer cost to make a trade was actually, oh, I don't get this right. It was actually less than what their internal cost was.
oof.
Right? Like that's when you wake up and say, okay, we better change.
Something's wrong.
What are they doing different? Right? That's right. And so I think those are the sort of watershed. You know, we'll find that sort of got their head in the sand and still doing sort of waterfall, and not that sort of waterfall is the only thing you have to do, but all the sort of bad habits, command and control, your sort of control, your you know, I mean the you know, your sort of behavior patterns, your culture, your sort of how you actually deliver software, your fear-based organization, you know, blameful, all those things. You know, if you see your competitor just pulling away, you sort of start figuring out like what's going on over there. You start like, what is this? What's this? What's this blamelessness? What, you know, and you know, what's psychological safety? What does that do? You know, so yeah. So no, I think we're, you know, there's no evidence that there, you know, that there isn't a lot of sort of conversation around, you know, quote unquote DevOps.
Yep. No, that makes sense. So let me ask you. So you mentioned that what you are doing is what you've always done, being like in consultant mode, that you go into organizations and start asking the questions and figure out why this whole DevOps thing or digital transformation thing is not picking up. So what do you see? Why we don't see this you know, this massive adoption or this ripple effect?
You know, so, you know, it's interesting. So, you know, one of the things that, you know, Gene gives me this compliment about that, you know, that one of my abilities is sort of to be able to sort of listen to people. I say listen to really smart people and then be able to translate it in a way that sort of everybody can understand, right? That's, I think if I have one superpower, it's being able to surround myself by incredibly smart people and then being able to sort of absorb and be enough of a pest to make sure I understand what they're saying, and then being able to sort of then turn around and talk to a room and explain that complex idea in sort of, you know, Gene always has the unicorns and the horses, right? I hang around with a lot of unicorns. I make sure I like nuts and bolts, you know, meat and potatoes, understand what they're saying. And then in a horse's mouth, which that's horrible, I basically explain it. So to that point, Jabe Bloom, who I work with, we're starting to, there's some blog articles on this and he's really, I just love the way this guy thinks, right? And so he started working with this idea of these three economies, and I love this stuff. So, and I think it fits really well. You know, like I have this sort of notion of like, we're not scaling. Why are we not scaling? But I haven't been able to sort of describe a more specific way of, you know, sort of like take it to the next level. And so here's this thing called the three economies. It's better done with a slide, but I didn't do it. If you think about what DevOps has been in the last decade, it's really been two economies. It's been a differentiation economy, right, which is typically your development, and then a scale economy, which is usually operations, right? So in a two economy world, right, basically you're trying to, you've got this sort of tension between accelerating differentiation. Like I'm a bank, I've got to have a better iPhone app than my competitor, and I've got to move really fast, or I get merged, and then the operations is about sort of scale, but really resilience and scale as sort of this unified element, right? And that's the economy. And what we've done magically over the last 10 years is figured out how to sort of at least try to figure out how to arbitrate those two problems, right? And you know, we call it DevOps. We say, let's break down any walls between these two economies. Let's go ahead and let's go ahead and sort of figure out ways to do collaboration, figure out ways to sort of automate the sort of the operations part for all the things, right? Like, we don't have to go through them all. But there's still tension there. And in fact, if you think about like SRE is almost in site reliability engineering, but like, I'm sure everybody knows that, but it actually is sort of the rubber meets the road, in my opinion, of that tension. Right? Like, so it's like,
I would agree.
What?
I think I would agree.
Yeah. But you're still dealing with sort of a two economy problem, right? But, so you got error budgeting and SLO and SLIs. And like, so there's sort of this admittance from Google that at scale, they really are two economies. So here's how you solve it, right? You sort of create these sort of abstract contracts between, sort of service development groups and operations, which are SRE. All right. So that's fine. So what Jabe has sort of described is a three economy world. So not just, not just sort of adoption and scale, right? So, but the third economy is in the middle, what he calls scope. And so a scope economy is about accelerating adoption. And I know this sounds very abstract, right? But then, so the idea is, if you can look at the world as three economies, and you have this sort of acceleration, and you have switch dev, and you have ops. And if you start thinking about, there's actually a middle economy or scope economy, which is about scaling adoption. So an example of, completely nothing to do with IT, right? You have sort of car manufacturers are making really fast cars, making cars that make turns at really high speeds. And then you have sort of the scale economy, which is sort of municipal laws and speeding limits and all these things. But it's actually these sort of super highways, they're like really flat roads in those, that really drive the adoption of these cars. Because you want to go fast. Right. And so if you think about, this is very self-serving for what we're doing at Red Hat, but it fits really well. Even it sort of describes the Google economy. I don't think Google's ever said we're a three economy company, but if you think about the original Borg and Omega, right, which ultimately manifests as Kubernetes as the open source project, and we would say OpenShift Kubernetes, but they actually run in this three economy model, because what they do is they actually have created less about a program, a platform as a service, but a platform as an interface. So developers, for the most part in Google, don't know anything about the infrastructure. And they created this separation that creates this acceleration, like these highways.
John, we lost you for a sec.
And so I really like this idea.
John, we lost you for a sec. What you were saying about the developers don't think about in Google?
Yeah, let me turn my video off. I know it's kind of crappy to use without a video, but I think that might help. So sometimes that helps. All right, boy, not having fun here. Now I'm back. All right, you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Yep, you can hear.
So developers at Google, for the most part, probably for all part, is they don't really know anything about the infrastructure. They don't know what type of storage. They don't really know what kind of compute. They have this sort of scope economy, which has been built for them originally, called Omega, and then or Borg, and then Omega, and then we see it manifest as Kubernetes. But and that their abstraction that they've created is the developers basically just know that there are interfaces, and that I was thinking about like the SRE discussion, right? Like, so when you in a way, like, SRE is just the arbitration between the two economies, which is scope, which is if I think about SRE is like, I go in and I'm a service team. I create all my non-functionals, my operationalization stuff, all the things plus the service. I go to SRE and I say, hey, you know, what's the SLO on this? We say it's 3 nines. We then sort of arbitrate on the cost of that. And then if I'm in the service team and I say, yeah, but like, what are you going to use for storage? I'm like, well, SRE, like, you can't, that's none of your business. Like, you don't get to ask that. And why do you want to know? Right. So the scope economy is about really sort of creating that abstraction interface that allows, and so I think there's a lot there I joke when I sort of halfway joke when I go in a large client or I do a presentation, I say, SRE, you're not Google. And let me say this again, you're not Google. So like, stop freaking out about all the things that you read about what the prescriptive notions of how you need to do SRE. Like some of my clients, like they spend more time having meetings about what they should do with SRE. Like, you know what? You want to save a bunch of money? Like, table all discussion to 2021. You know, but you can say that you're not Google. You know, Google has one application. They've got this beautiful sort of boundary interface that allows, you know, Mark Burgess, you know, who wrote the foreword to the SRE book, the founder of Infrastructure as Code, the creator of CF Engine, a really good buddy of mine. You know, he said one time in a conversation, is one of the things that Google did that was brilliant, which was make a non-deterministic infrastructure look like a deterministic infrastructure to their developers. But isn't that beautiful? And that's sort of what a scope economy is. So I think it's not the only thing we're thinking about, but I do think there's sort of that you're not Google, you want to be like Google. Google has one application, you have 17 businesses with thousands of applications, but a way that you could become like Google is start thinking as not just platform as a service, but platform as an interface, start understanding your, what is the holistic view of your organizational structure in terms of economies? What do you really want to achieve? Do you really want your developers? I mean, you can't scale if your developers are having the right YAML to decide what sort of storage they use, right? I mean, God bless everything, you know, OpenShift, Kubernetes and everything, but we're never going to scale if, you know, every other month somebody's having to learn a new stanza in a YAML definition that describes complex networking and complex storage and, to a certain extent, complex routing and compute to nodes, right? Like, we'll just never scale. And by the way, Google doesn't operate that way. Nobody on the development side knows that they're running like layer 3 advanced networking via open source, open flow stuff. Mm-hmm. They'll never have to know that. So anyway, that's part of it. I think there's some other things that sort of I've been thinking about, you know, and as you know, the one thing I've really been hunkered down over the last, probably 2 years, maybe 3 years is more than just DevSecOps, but really focusing on things like automated governance, cloud automated governance, policy as code. How do we sort of get these sort of rusty old, sort of spreadsheet policy regulations in large banks sort of automated and built into the non-human sort of evidence or attestation models inside the pipelines. I've been spending a lot of time on that.
So let me try and rephrase it and see if I understood correctly. The scale economy is an abstraction that encapsulates those two conflicting economies in order to make sure that they coexist and actually be DevOps, if you wish.
Well, yeah, and it's the scope economy. So you have
scope. Yeah,
you got
scope
it.
Economy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and it's about scale of adoption, right? Yes. That's the key, right? Where scale is about scale of infrastructure. Oh my God, I got to worry about scale. I got these like knucklehead developers. I'm only kidding. Knucklehead developers that are just asking for stuff as fast as I can, and I've got 2 jobs. I got to keep up with their scale, and I got to make it resilient.
Yeah.
And in sort of that bimodal economy structure, you know, that's what we're left with. If you sort of separate that into sort of a trimodal, if that's a phrase, 3 economies, then you sort of can really look at like how, and then to me, the beauty of that is that everybody sort of wants to be like Google, whether they want to admit it or not, but they can't, right? But if you start thinking this way, you in the enterprise, you actually can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and this is that might be one of the things that are in the way of DevOps adoption in the end of the day, because we can sing Kumbaya as much as we like and talk about how important it is that those two worlds, the dev and ops, will come together, but in the end of the day, their underlying conflicting basic incentives are not going away no matter what we say.
That's exactly right. That is the meta point. That's the thing. When I first really understood what SRE was, and I think a lot of people listen to me because I always wonder if I'm describing stuff on such a meta level. I'm like, everybody like, what the heck is this guy talking about? But if only a couple of people get it, like I feel good. But the thing when I first understood what, and actually when the time I really understood SRE, I have this other gift, although we didn't do it this year, but Kelsey's family is from Kelsey Hightower's family is from Atlanta. So like we get together for what turns out to be a really long lunch when he comes back to Atlanta. And it was a few years back, and we were just talking about in general, sort of Google and how things worked and SRE and it was sort of an awkward point of a conversation. And I guess I'll say this. He asked me like why I didn't ever, why don't I work at Google? And I'm like, well, first nobody asked, but second, like I don't think I even fit in and know what to do there. And then we had this conversation about like, how SRE toil works, and I made a comment of how I saw toil actually working in the enterprises. Well, that's what you do at Google, but it was enlightening because at that point I really understood that what SRE really meant. And in fact, I remember having an argument with Damon, who'd done a lot more, Damon Edwards, a really good friend of mine, who had done a lot more research on SRE, and he was like, no, that's wrong. I'm like, no, and finally it took me like weeks to tell him like, oh yeah, you're right. But the thing I understood at that point about SRE was, it was sort of Google's admittance that there is a rubber meets the road tension that you're gonna have to hit at some level of scale. And then there was no real way to define that tension. I guess you could say SRE is the best way to describe. And trust me, like we could do another podcast on this because you could get me going on what SRE has to look like in the enterprise. And it's not the way these kids are describing it at SoundCloud and other places, right? I mean, you can do SRE with its philosophical tenets in the enterprise. Just like, but you're not Google. So like, okay, you're 5 generations of technology, you've got things going from, iPhones back to sort of WAS and MQ DB2 databases on mainframes. But the point is that as an industry, I think Jabe to me is the first one to sort of open that up as a describable, well, first off, just calling it economies, it's like, duh, why didn't I think of that? But then sort of saying that there really is, there's this third economy in the middle that is scope. And if we can use that as our sort of a way to have a discussion for the next decade, it enables us to have a clearer picture about there really are 3 things we have to deal with, not just 2. And you nailed it, that there is sort of a tension point where there is a third thing, and you have to at some point admit that you have to describe that.
This is a pretty complex ecosystem there. Delicate balance.
Yeah, Andrew says that that maybe it might be too complex for people to describe. I'm like, okay, now you've dared me, so
challenge accepted.
That's right. Yeah. So that's been a lot of exciting and stuff. And then the other stuff, I did, you all saw, and I got to present some of the stuff at your conference, at Swamp Up, and I still, again, I like your company, it's for no other reason as I like Sony, I like you guys. I love the DNA of JFrog. I mean, I always have from the first time I met you guys. I like the fact that you think I'm smart, so that helps too. And but you know, just the you know, I've presented the DevOps automated governance stuff at Swamp Up a couple of times. What we did in that paper, you know, last year, you know, Gene sort of you know, invites 50 of us up to Portland every year, and you know, we wrote this DevOps automated governance. It's on IT Revolution. It's Creative Commons. It's a pretty cool paper. In fact, it was Kit Merker who actually got me started on the idea originally, kind of ironically. But you know, but one of the things, a couple of companies have taken that a whole nother level forward. And so instead of just having this sort of attestation model in the pipeline, they're starting to go to the policy people in the banks and helping them design. And so I've got one company, we're going to present it. We were going to present it to co-present it at the Red Hat Summit, but we're trying to figure out how to do that virtually now. But where the policy people now write YAML files, what they call policy as code or PAC files. And then that drives into the automated attestation model. So now you got the policy, instead of policy people having to translate the risk to IT people, and IT people figuring out how to sort of attest that. You know, what you're doing is cutting out the middleman, and then basically now having sort of the policy people specifically divide in YAML what drives the attestation, which ultimately becomes the proof or evidence for audits.
Yes.
So that's really cool. And then one of the things we're starting to do the version 2 of that now. We're going to do, none of us are going to Portland this year. Obviously, nobody's going anywhere, but we're doing we're doing the second version of that. And we're going to really focus on sort of policy automation, policy as code. But the other thing we're going to try to tackle is sort of, if you could do that, could you have policy error budgets? Right. So if you've gotten to the place where you've actually built and I won't go into detail because you can watch the link, so you can download the book. It's called DevOps Automated Governance on IT Revolution. It's Creative Commons. It's free.
Yeah, it's going to be on the show notes both.
Okay, good. So if you go there and then you think about this policy as code is the next generation and that. So if you get all that right, then you're sort of automating what the policy people expect for the particular services. Then you actually are creating the control points of attestation. Like, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you have this? Did you do this? And so those were basically, just like anything else, can become gates for an error budget model. So now you've got error budget and policy. Now we haven't done that yet. It's more of a thought process that we're going to try to put together. But so that's been really interesting. And then the other thing I got involved with, sort of through luck, is there's a group called ONEM. It's the Open Network Users Group. It's got Nick Lippis has been running it for years. They got really big in networking during the SDN era. A lot of his working group clients are you know, the biggest banks in New York, and they got wind of that paper, the automated governance. So we started a kind of a preliminary working group with some really large companies like FedEx, publicly FedEx. Cigna, Kaiser Permanente, United Technologies, and a couple of the banks. And we actually opted to go right into sort of cloud governance, which is a little different, but it's really cool. So we're sort of working through sort of how can we get the cloud providers to do attestations back to client tenants. So imagine like one of them would be the a signed a signature log event if the boot sequence changes, right? Because that happens all the time, and at scale for a particular tenant, not knowing that actually could create an additional attack surface that you don't know, right? And it's not sort of not normal that a cloud would basically say, oh, by the way, we changed. They figure this is all. And the interesting is we're not going to ask the cloud providers to give us any sort of IP. Just give us sort of a signed signature event that we know that we can check and know that like the boot sync was changed. So something really, we know at that point we should do some type of forensics about our infrastructure. And another one is when a cloud provider, and the other thing we're asking for is a normalized format, because one of the things that a lot of the cyber and sort of CISO teams have to do is they have to become experts at each different cloud, right? So I know how to get this log from Azure and this log from that. So we're asking for a common format. And so the second thing is that and I'm learning a lot on this too. Like, so like if a cloud provider adds a feature to an existing service, it actually can break the client's tenant's security, your routing structure unknowingly. And so the assumption from the cloud providers is that you'll know that once you decide to use this service or feature within a service. And yes, if that point you were going to use a feature in a service, you should probably do an exhaustive, like, what does this look like? How is it? But the problem is a client might decide, we're not going to use that feature and not even know about the feature. And they're actually, so the security posture might be compromised because the feature has actually just been turned on and not even used. So there's a couple more like that, a common security framework so getting sort of a push-pull notifier from all the cloud providers in a common format. So you don't have to go into this cloud security framework versus this one versus that. So it's all about sort of getting sort of cloud telling you. The biggest one too is really interesting. It's going to be hard. Is a cloud provider knows every ingress request that you make as a tenant to them.
Sure, of course. Right.
So, but you as a sort of tenant or client or consumer can eventually get a bunch of logs and stuff to figure that out.
Yeah, you could.
But wouldn't it be nice if they just gave you sort of event notifier of every ingress request from a tenant?
That would be way easier and
it would be cool, right? Because now you can sort of do denial of service. You can detect anomalous behaviors like crypto miners, without having to do sort of like after the fact, forensics on logs. So anyway, this all should be published in May. So, and again, that's all going to be, I don't work on any project that's not Creative Commons. So that's all going to be Creative Commons too. So that's really taken up quite a bit of my time and continue to focus on those areas.
Well, that was cool. I look forward to that being published so I can dig into it a little more for sure.
Yeah, no, totally.
And this is all a work part of this, what you mentioned, the
ONUG.
It's ONUG, right? ONUG. Yeah. Again, I'm going to post this in the show notes as well, so people can take a look. And all this standardization effort is where does it stand?
Say that again. Sorry.
All this effort, the standardization effort of the open network user group, where does it stand in terms of adoption, in terms of kind of,
so the idea is this, so it's sort of going to be a voice of reason, right? So a lot of people are getting like, we're never going to collaboratively do this. So the idea is like, if you think about the companies that are sort of writing the paper, like FedEx, United Technologies, Cigna, KP, I think we have JP Morgan Chase, and then we're going to add another ring to it once we sort of have our first cut of sort of reviewers. And so the idea is that if you had like trillions of, $1 trillion of buying power. So we're actually not going to the cloud provider and say, you will need to give us this, because they'll tell us to jump in the lake. But if we have like, 20 logo cloud consumers, and say, and hold that paper up and say, yes, we believe this is something you can do. I think that, so I keep reminding everybody, it's not a cloud provider ask, it's an industry ask. We're not trying to create a standards body. We're just trying to make a common sense industry ask to say, this would be really helpful to do cyber, cloud governance at scale. If the cloud providers could give us normalized formats of these 3 or 4 things.
I don't think it's a huge ask either, considering the sheer size of the benefit. I don't think it's a big ask.
It's a benefit for everybody. And then the other thing, I agree. And the other thing too is, the thing we're being really clear about is we're not asking for any IP. So don't interpret, like, we don't want to know anything about your boot sequence.
Just standardize it.
Right. Well, we don't care. We just want a signature that tells us that the sequence has changed.
Sure.
Right. Like, so it's a checksum for whatever way against all the things you do in the boot sequence, that every time we're doing, and that becomes another attestation in the DevOps automated governance model. So maybe the first thing you do after the pull request, right, is you go out and the first thing you do in the build is you go check to see if the sort of boot sequence attestation signature is still the same.
Sure.
you know, and yeah, so yeah, being really clear that we're not on any of these asks. We just want sort of more of a sort of something that just assures us that what we thought you looked like still looks the same. So, you know, and those can be, again, you know, and then you ball that into audits, then you're sort of saying that, you know, we feel really confident that this thing that's running in production right now has, you know, all the things that we believe as a bank should be in accordance to our governance models, our compliance and governance models. And, you know, there are black swans, but to the point of that, we actually are looking at all the angles. Did the cloud provider change something that opened up a whole lot of holes out there for us? You know, so yeah, no, it's I've been really excited about that, and then the other thing I'm really excited about. I want to make more noise about this. I'm going to do less work on this, but really sort of, you know, try to kick people in the butt to get motivated. Red Hat on the CTO team just hired 2 of my soccer playing guys. So from the I'm going to get in trouble. Is the criminals once known as Docker. I
was from my LaCroix, so thanks.
I'm allowed to say that, and Baruch knows why. But but we hired two, like one Brent Salisbury, who's, I mean, back in the day, Martin Casado used to quote him because Brent was running OpenFlow at the University of Kentucky Hospital before Nicira was actually had production customers. You know, and so he understands networking and, you know, again, going through sort of what we did with soccer play, and he was a core committer on Open Daylight, and now he's working back at Red Hat on Edge stuff. So I'm really, my danger zone is I get into too many things and I do everything crappy. But I think there's a really good story about, you know, what networking, how do we take advantage of networking in the newer models because of this, you know, when you're talking about putting shipping containers near stadiums and cell phone towers that are running racks of Kubernetes.
Yes.
Like we really probably need to up our game on networking, right? And what software defined networking really means in those models. So I'm really happy that 2 of the guys that were part of our original soccer plane now are back at Red Hat and working under the CTO office. So that I think that'll help Red Hat like significantly. So I'm having fun. Yep.
No, it is interesting, and obviously the network attestations are a topic that close to home for us because you know, our work on providing metadata about artifacts and actually trying to guarantee to some reasonable extent that the what you build and what you promote is what actually is run in production. So I think this is all very, very interesting and relevant. So thank you for sharing that. As I mentioned, we'll post that the user group, the Open Network user group link in the show notes. I see that they have a virtual event coming up in May.
That's where we're going to present. That was going to be a live event, obviously. Now it's virtual, but that's where we're going to. We were going to do the presentation of the paper there. But we're going to do it now as a virtual presentation.
Okay, cool. We'll tune in for that.
Yeah, absolutely. We will definitely join to see how it shapes up, and obviously how can we tie it back to the work that we do on the metadata on the builds and the metadata of the distribution and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's old cliche. It takes a village, right? Like I said early on. I mean, if I walked into a shop and they had really no serious notion of how they managed artifacts and source artifact as like a critical component. I know that's not the only thing you do these days, but that if they didn't know that was sort of like critical to just holistic, a holistic, kind of security posture in DevOps, they would be out, you'd be like, okay, you guys are lost.
Get it together.
Yeah. So I do think that, dependency, all the things that go into the complexities there, I think you have to sort of, it's one of the reasons I really love the DevOps automated governance, because it really was not vendor specific, and it sort of fit with most of the vendors that were doing the right stuff in the right way. You know, the original DevOps automated governance, right? Like we have out of 7 stages to describe, 2 of the boxes, you know, in our sort of our implementation version, you know, JFrog was the selected tool that we used. Artifactory was the tool that we used for those 2, right? I mean, again, we weren't making recommendations. We were just sort of going through, like, at every stage, where would we get attestations from, right? And you know, clearly sort of, you know, dependencies and artifacts, which were 2 of the 7 stages. Yeah, so it definitely takes a village. And I think the more that we sort of approach the holistic way of thinking through this, you know, back to the thing earlier, right? The third economy, right? The third economy works when the things that are in that sort of primordial soup of what I call platform as an interface, or what the GTO team is calling a platform as interface, is that you have to have all these things.
Yep.
And they have to be seamless to the sort of developers, and for the most part, actually seamless from the infrastructure people of really caring what the developers are doing specifically. Yeah.
Very much. Yeah, that obviously it all makes sense, and there is a lot of work to do there yet. So I think, yeah, it's what you described. We're kind of on the verge of the next step when everybody already understands the importance and the need, and now we have to deal with the real tough problems, which is, you know, how we scale it and how we create the ripple effect. For sure.
And I think also, like I said, I don't just do this because I'm on your podcast. I told you, you know, how long it took you to sort of pester me to read your book, and I promise you next time. And I'd feel so guilty, and you'd ping me and like, John, and I thought it would be okay and good, but like I loved it, you know, like the liquid software, and I think that's just a great metaphor for like what the next 10 years looks like, right? Which is the fact that we'll be forced to think about delivering software completely different than we did 5 years ago.
Yeah, and obviously attestations and the quality and the assurance that what you actually get is what you wanted people to ship to you is the critical piece in creating this trust, because that's the problem that we face right now. So the trust issue, one of the reasons we cannot actually go faster than we go at the moment is that the users that get the updates cannot trust them. They have to do the acceptance testing. This takes time. It slows everything down. And obviously getting rid of it, it's all about trust. It's a trust in your software provider, and it means that the processes are right, they're working, they can ensure the quality, and obviously they can ensure the authenticity of what you are getting, and that's the problem.
Yeah, you know, I recently did a sort of a DevOps for regulated environments presentation to an executive team at a bank, right? And at the end of the CI, I said, okay, John, you know, I'd use my 7 deadly diseases and all that stuff, but he said, okay, so all right, we suck. Like you just told me we suck. I'm like, oh, like, he's like, but like, you know, we're trying to do the right things, but like, how do we, given that we have all these things? And I said, yeah, I mean, the bottom line is, you know, like, you know, and this guy, I talked to him on a couple of things, so I knew he had the sort of right way of thinking. Like he was so your classic intent-driven CIO. So he understood the right way to run an organization, you know, which wasn't command and control, wasn't blameful. But, you know, and I said, you know, I know that's part of DNA, but you still have this problem, which is, you know, like a lot of banks are just run by lawyers. And like, and so, you know, so how do you deal with, like, you want to go faster and you want to do this thing, and then you have to sort of cut out, you have to sort of focus on the noise, and then you don't know what the noise is unless you go sort of talk to all the people. And what you find is what I find, which everybody says, but I find it when I interview. I mean, last 3 years before I came to Red Hat, I've interviewed some of the largest banks. I spent a month at one of the largest banks. You know, I've presented on this at Swamp Up, but and Yalla DevOps. But that what I find is, you know, the development teams, the crack, these young kids will tell me they can whip out a major application in like 1 or 2 weeks, but it takes 6 to 8 weeks to get it implemented, because all the bank's policy NFR, the risk NFRs, and all these things that they have to cut and paste and put these, grab these and fill out these forms and business continuity and all these things. And so you don't magically walk in and wipe those out because they're so legacy. Nobody knows on policies. But if you start working on automated governance and attestations and policies code, you start closing the gap on the variance. It's easier to sort of converge, because now you're sort of driving forward and you're shrinking the variance of all those sort of ridiculously, like the thing is a bank will never be able to have a summit where everybody sits down and says, okay, everybody in the room, let's figure out these 1980s and 90s policy regulations that don't even make sense anymore. And let's just spend the next 2 weeks figuring out how to arbitrate that. It can't happen. It won't.
We're not going to do that.
Economically, it's impossible. So you're just stuck in this sort of vicious cycle of people like saying, why do I have to write a business continuity definition for data that's stored on S3, right? And like, they're like, is there somebody we can talk to? And they're like, I don't know. There's somebody out there. But if you start driving these automated sort of attestation and policies code, it sort of cleans itself up.
And it'll be a bear to get them to switch, but
yeah, I mean, an example,
in the long run,
PNC, like some of the banks are actually, I think John has talked about this, but some of the banks, it may be another bank too, but what they'll do is now they're bringing the policy bill into the ideation phase. And so now they're walking in and saying, okay, you're going to need these 5 risks for this service. And then they become JIRA tickets. And then and those are attestations, right? Yeah. And then the sort of service team can look at one and say, you know what, we're going to reject this one. And here's our description. Well, that becomes an emergent pattern. So the next time you do a service, and it's got that sort of NFR, that sort of risk, it's already sort of defined as an acceptable rejection or exception in this case. So you actually start cleaning out the sort of ridiculous NFRs without having any humans. It sort of emergently gets cleaned up, right? And my answer was, that's the way you sort of get better at this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's the same process that we experienced with any other kind of quality assurance, right? It's the same with tests. Once we establish automated tests, we don't need to check it manually.
Exactly.
And it's the same. Once you establish a good governance and attestations process, you don't need to test it manually. You don't need to fill all those documents and make sure that they're all signed up and reviewed manually and everything. This is how we transform everything with automation. It's exactly the same process.
That's a good comparison. It should have been obvious to me, but yeah, the whole how you went from sort of manual testing to automated testing, and then how all the sort of, even though you knew there were going to be a certain level of benefits, but you found all these sort of unattended benefits that happened that made you accelerate. Like things got cleaner, it got easier, it was repeatable, and I think it's the same thing that I think we're going to find when we start, treating risk, automated governance as we did automated testing. In fact, there's the sort of comparisons. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, humans we're more error prone than computers are. If we have to do something repeatedly, we're going to eventually get bored or distracted and make a mistake. And that's not something a bank can afford to do with security.
Yeah, and if you go back to the original Deming stuff, right? Like, which I'm also a geek on, which is, Deming didn't say this, but there's many disciples of Deming that said, variance is the root of all evil, right? Right, like it is, at scale, variance is what will sort of murder you. Something, even I think it was in Jez's Lean Enterprise, or where he has the story of the 1 byte difference in a module in a code, in sort of some code, right? Like, and it was 1 byte difference between sort of the QA and the prod, and it was like a week to discover the problem, like the sort of Heisenberg stuff, right? So variance, when you think about sort of the butterfly effects of complex systems, or just complex systems in general, and you think about any level of variance, when you put those two together, you're just going to obviously have, your overhead of all the things that you do, it's just going to be more costly. So tightening the variance on, to your point, Kat, like, humans, there's certain things humans have to do, right? So I think
absolutely. Creative thinking requires a human.
Exactly. Ideation and things we can do there. But certainly when we, to your point, if we are allowing humans to sort of do this repetitive thing over and over, we're creating a level of, example of like why infrastructure code has been so popular over the last 10 years. People used to manually build their dev environment, manually build their QA environment, and manually build their production environments.
Nobody wants to do that.
And they just weren't going to be the same, like,
yeah.
and that was going to add a level of variance that was at scale big enough to cause these weird sort of Heisenbugs that like you either never figure out or you spend like 18 hours on a production system downtime trying to figure out how to fix it.
Yeah, I do so much of my work in containers now that.
That was another reason why containers were so popular. They had this immutable effect, right? So it even create another whole level of minimized variation. So
yeah, the it works on my machine, I don't know why it doesn't work on yours excuse doesn't really fly as much now that we can just work in containers. Like it works on my machine, so I'll ship my machine.
Yeah, no, it was a big part of what sort of accelerated the whole container sort of adoption craziness and where we are today. No, yeah, so it's all, I mean, at the end of the day, like, when young people ask me about like, what should I do? And I do these things with Georgia Tech and universities where they invite me once a year. And I'm like, just find a job where 8 out of 10 days you wake up with a smile on your face because you think it's really cool. Because there are days that suck no matter where you are. But like, most days you're waking up and thinking, oh man, I'm going to be working on this, and this. And I think most of us in this industry, like we've been blessed to have that.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and especially today, we are the last people to complain with everything that's going on. We still have work. We still have our jobs. We still have work to do. We're trying to do our best. And I think the work that you are doing, helping the industry getting getting in better shape in terms of building trust, is in the end of the day one of the most important ones. And for that, we thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you guys. Like I said, it does definitely take a village, whether you believe that or not. But it takes it takes you, you guys sort of driving, sort of the way you drive adoption, the conferences that you run, and and it takes people like me and other sort of people that sort of contribute their time to I get not to get too sort of gushy, if you will, but I really do get a kick out of like meeting somebody 2 years after they've seen one of my presentations and tell me that something I said really sort of drove their sort of energy into something, and like that probably more rewarding than anything even I've gotten financially over the years. So
that's heartwarming. That's the whole reason I like public speaking, in case I want to genuinely bring something useful to somebody.
Yeah, there are people out there that sit and they really want to learn, and when they hear the right thing from the right person, it sort of, I don't want to say in the grand scheme of things it doesn't change their life, because life is more than what we do. It's your family, it's all the things. Sure. But it does sort of change their life, right? And that's a pretty damn good feeling, right? So
it really is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So on this optimistic note, I think we can wrap up. John, thank you very much. It was, as usual, fascinating, and I think we learned a lot. We're going to post all the links or a lot of things that we spoke about, which is whatever out of it is linkable on the show notes. This podcast is available again on JFrog YouTube channel and on podbean.com/DevOpsSpeakeasy. Also on, hopefully on all our Twitters. Let's do the Twitter pronunciation and exercise. I just love it, how hard it is for everybody. John, you start first. What's your Twitter handle?
Oh yeah, so it's Botchagalup, BOTCHAGALUP, and I am actually J Willis at redhat.com, but I'll always be botchagalup@gmail.com. So.
Here you go. What is this? What is this word? I always wanted to.
That's another hour podcast, my friend.
Oh my God!
It's a silly name that my that when I was a young kid, my mom used to sort of sing this song, and when we were all getting our first internet identities on sort of Twitter, and like I look back, like I could have got JMW, man. Why didn't I get JMW? But I thought I'd be clever and I'd use this thing, and in a lot of ways it's been good. It's terrible for pronouncing and remembering, but yeah, it has. There's some interesting folklore that people have come up to me and told me about it, and I've actually compiled some like real funny stories about their story about this word, but I never.
All right. And Kat has also a Twitter handle with a twist. What's the story behind it?
So my Twitter handle is Dixie3Flatline. That is the number 3. It is a reference to something, and nobody ever gets it, and it makes me a little bit sad. Like one person has gotten it. So if you know what that is a reference to, please DM me. Don't say it on the podcast. Guess if you know what it is. DM me and I will send you a t-shirt.
Can you give me a hint? Can you give me a hint?
A hint?
This is what my kids do to me all the time, right? Like they make me give like, and it's be a good hint so it doesn't make it real easy, but you got me like, and it's just so I don't waste too much time trying to figure out what this is.
No, you have to try to figure it out. That's exactly.
You got to figure it out.
Like even with a really abstract one hint.
Abstract hint.
It's tech related.
All right, good. That's good. Okay, that's good. All right, fair enough.
All right, okay. And I am the most boring of all of you. I am at Baruch on Twitter. And I think with that, thank you very much, John. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Kat. It was a pleasure. And see you in the future episodes of the DevOps Speakeasy podcast.
Yeah, sounds